Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different from my usual content, an iceberg. It's going to be about Japanese history, which is something I know a decent amount about. I have a personal focus mostly in the post-war history of Japan, so the iceberg is going to reflect that. I don't intend to change the nature of my content entirely, but I think icebergs are a fun way for me to touch on many different things really fast. And in my iceberg I have removed the most commonly known parts of Japanese history. You already know it, so I don't need to talk about it. If the response to this video is good, then I'll mix it in with more regular uploads. If not, then I won't continue the series. So let's start with Tier 1. Tier 1 is just below entry level. You may have heard of this stuff before, but not all of it. First up is the Fugu Plan. It's one you've probably heard of before. The Russian Revolution of 1917 eventually brought the Japanese into Siberia to support the Russian whites in the region. This expedition into Siberia cost Japan a lot more money and lives than the First World War ever did for them. Like a significant amount, enough that people wanted something from it. And yet Japan got nothing from the venture and pulled out in 1921. However, among the remaining influences was a hatred of communism and their first experiences with the work known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Starting off strong, ain't that right, folks? The document was a fabrication created during the early 1900s in Russia. Now, after World War I, as the White Russians fled across the world, and during the 1920s the document was translated and spread around. Japan received their first edition around that time. One of the first men to publish a translation was Sakai Katsutoki. Sakai had a lot of interesting opinions. He was very much pro-Jewish in spite of the work he was publishing, and thought, in essence, that it was proof of the power of the Jews and other things that I'll talk about later. He had some measure of influence among occult circles in Japan, and by that right, some level of influence among the far-right military circles. In 1931, when Japan invaded and made Manchuria theirs outright, the operation was heavily praised in Japan, but considered illegal by the rest of the world. Dreams to make Manchuria into an industrial hub led to a desire for investment and support from great corporations. While companies like Nissan, for example, jumped at the deal, Japan only had so much money, and so foreign investment was necessary. In spite of this, no foreign funding was forthcoming. So the Japanese leaders in Manchuria, having been predisposed to viewing Jews as an all-powerful entity, began to search for foreign support. In spite of an initial stumbling block on account of White Russians in Harbin kidnapping and killing a Jewish man, the connection grew deeper over time. A plan popularly known as the Fugu Plan, named for the dangerous, poisonous pufferfish, was conceived. The hope was that the Jewish financial elite would feel inclined to invest in Manchuria. In addition to this, Jews could help pressure the US to take a more favorable position to Japan's expansionism in continental Asia. The planners really believed that if they got the rabbis and other influential Jewish business leaders on their side, that the US could be swayed to avoid conflict with Japan, and that investment would flow into Manchuria. However, as the 1930s wore on, Jews began to leave Europe. They were turned away from many places, the UK, France, and even the United States. Eventually, an increasing number of Jews went east, to Harbin in Manchuria, or Japanese-occupied Shanghai. Soon, the Jewish Council of the Far East was created in Harbin. Its leader, Abraham Kaufman, had connections to Japanese military officials, and soon plans to create some sort of Jewish autonomy in Manchuria were being mulled over. Special laws were being drawn up to allow Jews into Manchuria, especially if they were industrialists or people with special skills. However, this was more out of a sense of taking advantage of the situation than a dedication to helping Jewish people avoid the Holocaust. Closer ties to Germany dampened Japan's enthusiasm for the project, but Japan never agreed to German demands for hostile actions against Jews in the East. Next up is the Kanto earthquake massacres. This one is already fairly well known, but the details might not be. On September 1st, 1923, an absolutely massive earthquake struck the Kanto plain. The earthquake caused major damage to most of Tokyo and the surrounding region, which was mainly built up of small wooden housing. However, even brick buildings, such as Japan's first skyscraper, the Ryoonkaku, were destroyed, given the strength of the earthquake. A lack of preparation and widespread damage led to many deaths, but fires spread throughout the wreckage, including a massive fire tornado that killed tens of thousands. Well over 100,000 people had died in less than 24 hours. This wasn't the end of the deaths, however. Amid all of the panic, rumors began to be spread that the Koreans were setting fires and were planning to overthrow the Japanese government. Obviously, this had no basis in reality whatsoever, but after what had just unfolded, the basic reality of what was or was not happening seemed to disappear from the minds of the average Japanese person. The reason why Koreans were so heavily targeted was likely because of an increasing number of Koreans that had come to reside inside of Japan. The high water margin for this would occur in 1945, but before the earthquake, the process had already begun. Local vigilance committees formed and tried to police certain areas, but in truth, many of these committees used their self-appointed positions as a pretext to commit massacres on Koreans. Any suspected Korean, usually determined via shibboleth, could be targeted and killed. Many people from outside of Tokyo were also targeted, including Chinese people or Japanese people from far-off, rural parts of Japan that had accents. Law had essentially ceased to exist despite the martial law order. During this period, socialists, anarchists, and even labor activists were also targeted. The most notable of these was the Amaterasu Incident. Military police captain Amaterasu Masahiko had essentially kidnapped leading anarchist Osugi Sake and his common-law wife Ito Noe and his nephew. Amaterasu killed them and then dumped their bodies in a well. Once martial law was lifted, the news of Osugi's disappearance spread and the truth was revealed. Amaterasu received a high level of public support as a Japanese patriot and was handed down a very light sentence of 10 years for his crimes, but served only just over 2. Perpetrators of the massacres received limited punishment, and the families of the victims received a very limited amount of compensation. Next up is the pollution diseases. Man, I really picked some dark stuff to talk about today. The pollution diseases, or rather the 4 big pollution diseases, are a series of illnesses that came from bad industrial pollution and a failure to deal with these issues. Minamata disease, Niigata-Minamata disease, Yokaichi asthma, and Itai-Itai disease all ravaged the affected populations, and even today, Japan suffers with the effects of these illnesses. Now, the exact details of all these illnesses demands a full video to give an in-depth description, but this is the short version of that story. These diseases were tied in with Japan's efforts to grow its industrial base and economy in the lead up to and after the Second World War. More factories, more good. More products, even gooder, no matter the cost. Itai-Itai disease dates back to 1912 from mining at Kamioka mines in Toyama. In processing zinc ore, a frequent byproduct is the toxic metal cadmium. And at the mine in Kamioka, how did they deal with it? They just tossed it into the river. The river was used for all crop irrigation, and fish from the river was frequently consumed there. So it's no surprise that soon after establishing the mine, people reported being sick. This illness, known as Itai-Itai-byo, essentially ouch-ouch disease, resulted in extreme pains in the spine and joints of the patients. Most of this is related to the fact that cadmium poisoning results in damage to the kidneys. For a long time, the effects of the mining was ill understood. The government in the 1920s had tried to address the additional damage to agriculture. However, it took until the 1950s for them to even attempt to find the source of the issue. At first, they figured it was going to be lead, but in 1955, they determined it was cadmium. This process was very similar for Minamata disease. The disease was named after the town it was reported in, Minamata, down in the south of Japan. Minamata at the time was almost rendered a company town, given how important the fertilizer factory there was for the local economy. Yet again, byproduct was released into the water. This time, the offending chemical was methyl mercury, first released into the waters around Minamata in 1951. In 1956, the first sufferers of the disease were identified. At first, believed to be contagious, the victims were isolated and had their homes disinfected. Soon, however, it became clear that there was something else going on as stories of cats and birds dying around the area began to pile up. The food of the victims, fish and shellfish from Minamata Bay, where the sludge had been dumped, ended up being eaten by the same cats and birds. Soon, the possibility of food contamination was considered, and eventually, mercury poisoning was proven as the cause. But this realization came too late for some. In fact, 35% of all victims died of the disease. Extreme levels of lead exposure in Minamata and other nearby fishing villages wreaked havoc on not just the locals there, but also the fishing economy. Soon, the company that ran the factory, Chiso, failed to discredit independent research and had to start payments to victims. However, they didn't actually address the issue and continued to dump methyl mercury under the guise of removing it from the wastewater, so effectively knowingly poisoning people. Niigata-Minamata disease was similar, however, it occurred later in 1964. Thankfully, very quickly, researchers from the original Minamata disease outbreak arrived and confirmed that this too was Minamata disease. The company there, Showa Denko, quickly tried the same thing that Chiso tried to do: discredit the researchers with their own research. The final of the big 4 pollution diseases that we have yet to discuss was Yokaichi asthma. In Mie Prefecture's Yokkaichi, years ago, they had been the center of Japan's petrochemical industry. Now, in the post-war period, the petrochemical industry in Japan had only grown as it transitioned away from coal. That's a whole other story, by the way. A failure to properly get rid of the sulfur in the crude oil being processed there led to a terrible smelling pollution. It killed fish and ruined the rest of them, leaving them greasy and smelly. Naturally, it was the sulfur. Areas around the plants were heavily affected, giving people asthma, chronic bronchitis, COPD, and emphysema. Children and older people were especially affected. In 1967, the community levied a lawsuit against the company, the first of the lawsuits for pollution that would be filed. This would be followed by the Niigata-Minamata disease lawsuit in 1968, the Minamata disease lawsuit in 1969, and the Itai-Itai disease lawsuit in 1971. All of the lawsuits were successful. Over the course of the 1950s until the early 1970s, Japan went through a massive shift. It had went from a society that was focused on growth of the economy almost exclusively to one that was starting to come around to the idea of a better life for its people and a focus on ecological issues. The more humanitarian approach of Sato Eisaku and then the populist Tanaka Kakue was foreshadowed by the changing opinions of the public, who grew more and more disgusted at the levels of pollution and the general low living standards of the average Japanese person in spite of high economic growth. But money from lawsuits didn't resolve the damage done. People had died, and people are still suffering the effects of these disasters till this day. Now time for something a little bit different, the hidden Christians. The story of Christians in Japan is a long one and has many twists and turns. Christianity began to spread first in 1549 from the works of Jesuit Francisco Xavier. Xavier and the other Jesuits believed that by converting the various daimyo, that people under them would soon follow. Very quickly, this plan was proven to be a genius one. Daimyo were converted and subsequently began to convert the local populations with the help of foreign Christian missionaries. That's not where they stopped, however, with many Christians engaging in attacks on Buddhist or Shinto temples and shrines in an attempt to stamp out non-believers. Tolerance had been replaced with intolerance by an aggressively growing religion. This shifting of the balance of power, Spanish and Portuguese imperialism in the Philippines, and the increasing trade of Japanese people as slaves by foreigners led to Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the hegemon of Japan at that time, to promulgate the Kenkyo-rei, a religious banning order. The ultimate successor to Toyotomi Hideyoshi and founder of the Tokugawa shogunate, Tokugawa Ieyasu, eventually followed with his own ban of Christianity in the shogunate as part of a larger isolationist Sakoku policy to protect Japan. Christians were persecuted en masse and were forced underground if they wished to avoid death or worse. Christians were burned to the stake and figured out with the use of a fumi-e, depictions of Christ that people were to step on to prove that they were not Christians. These groups were often small and always hidden, keeping various Christian symbols hidden for religious use and taking the Virgin Mary and disguising her as the Buddhist deity Kannon. Even in hiding, they would do their prayers in Latin. However, the liturgy and story of Christianity was kept as an oral history, meaning that there were many divergences that appeared over time. Most notable was the seeming disappearance of the concept of original sin. Instead, Adam and Eve were forgiven by God, it seems. This is probably because of how difficult it would be to remember parts of the Old Testament and New Testament orally. In 1865, the building of the Oura Church in Nagasaki was finished, and shortly thereafter, several hidden Christians arrived to worship there. Japan's hidden Christians were uncovered, shocking the Japanese and Catholic authorities who were convinced that Christianity had died out hundreds of years ago in Japan. The hidden Christians largely returned to Catholicism thereafter. Next up is another you likely have some vague knowledge of, the Holdouts. You've heard about them before. After World War II, there were some soldiers who didn't surrender. There was a variety of reasons as to why this happened. Some didn't believe the surrender at first. Others took part in the post-World War II independence movements in countries like Vietnam or Indonesia. Some were afraid of false rumors. Others preferred to live where they were, and then there were those who were essentially compelled to work for their local governments. For example, a number of Japanese officers were compelled to fight for the Kuomintang. The vast majority of holdouts known in the Western world were men who either didn't believe in the surrender or didn't agree with it. Most holdouts were done by the 1950s, with some holding out for a little bit longer than that. The last of these figures were largely in the Philippines or in Guam. The most famous of these holdouts was Onoda Hiro in the Philippines. Onoda was in a group with a number of other soldiers who were hiding in the jungle. surviving off of stolen food. The group was pretty militant and frequently attacked civilians, Philippine police, and even soldiers. Over time, the other men died one by one until Onoda was alive in the mid-1970s. However, news reports alleging that Onoda could be alive inspired the young Suzuki Norio, who had just returned from abroad, to go searching. He vowed to find Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman in that order. After only a brief time of searching, Suzuki had found Onoda and convinced him to surrender to his commanding officer. And just as a side note, there were Japanese fighting wars after the 1970s abroad. Tanaka Seimei and his co-worker Hashimoto are typically left off lists online because they weren't originally Japanese soldiers. The pair fought for the Malayan Communist Party until the party dissolved itself in 1989. The last Japanese soldier to return to Japan will likely be Tanaka Akio, who returned to Japan in 2017. Given that most World War II veterans are in their 90s now, it's unlikely that there will be any left to return home. Hirohito in Disneyland. Hirohito first visited his old adversary, the United States, in 1971 for a short visit. It wasn't particularly long. However, upon his second visit in 1975, it was a more involved schedule. He went to Colonial Williamsburg, Washington, D.C., New York, Cape Cod, and even Walt Disneyland. The visit wasn't super important, but it did lead to a number of odd photographs, and Hirohito got a Mickey Mouse watch that he treasured until his last days. Kinda weird, but funny story. Another funny story, the Tojo Headslap. Okay, so that was it. Okawa Shume was potentially pretending to be insane, no one's totally sure. He also shouted a number of words in English and German during the trial before he was taken aside and ruled as suffering from insanity because of syphilis. Malaria therapy improved his status, but he was never given the okay to be tried. During his hospitalization, he translated the Quran. He avoided the death penalty, but he lived out the rest of his life in semi-retirement. Okay, too many funny things. Time to get dark. Kishi Nobusuke. There is a decent chance you've heard of Kishi Nobusuke before. He was Abe's grandpappy and a Class A war criminal. Also happened to be Japan's prime minister between 1957 and 1960. Kishi had started out as an expert bureaucrat in the Ministry of Commerce and Agriculture and possessed a critical eye towards free market capitalism while not being left-leaning. Fascism, we call that fascism. Kishi very quickly ascended the ranks, and in 1936, he went to Manchuria and served in a high-ranking role in the puppet government's economic bureaucracy. In time, he became essentially the economic point man for Manchukuo. From there, he used his influence and finances to break into politics by ending up as Tojo's Commerce and Industry Minister. After the war, he was arrested as a Class A war criminal. However, he was ultimately not prosecuted. This is mainly for two reasons. The first being that Kishi was not actually involved in the starting of the war with the US and had actually worked against Tojo later on. Secondly, Kishi's involvement in operations in Manchuria were simply never brought up. In 1952, with the ending of the occupation, Kishi was able to return to politics. In short order, he took part in the 1955 creation of the Liberal Democratic Party. Kishi was sort of in between the two major political factions of the party and was a notable political figure already, so he was made the Minister of Foreign Affairs. This was a unique position for him to be in, given that he was avowedly anti-American. Well, at the start. Before long, Kishi played golf with the Americans and had come to see President Dwight Eisenhower as a pal. In 1957, when Prime Minister Ishibashi Tanzan had a sudden stroke, Kishi was raised to the prime ministership, and he was eager to seal the deal with the US to keep Japan in the American camp, but to make it more independent. That went quite poorly, but that's a different story for a different tier. Next up is the Sorge Incident. Richard Sorge was a German who worked in Japan, but he also worked for the Soviets. You see, Sorge had once been a right-wing nationalist, but World War I led him to shift away from that. Instead, he became a leftist and then a communist. He became a journalist and was recruited by the Soviet intelligence service. First, he worked in the UK, and then his native Germany, then China, and then finally Japan in 1933. While in Japan, Sorge was focused on if Japan intended to attack the Soviet Union or not, and if so, when. To this end, he recruited a small network of informants. Among those was Ozaki Hotsumi. Ozaki was a journalist who had been shocked by the cruelty of the Second Sino-Japanese War. As an agent of Sorge, he became close to political heavyweight and future Prime Minister Konoe Fumimaro. He had even become a member of Konoe's political club and think tank. Ozaki was close to Konoe, and Sorge was close to Yugen Oat. the military attaché to Japan from Germany. Ott later became the diplomat for Germany in Japan and ultimately became the most important source of information on Japan's politics inside of Germany. Ott's information came largely through Sorge. Through Ott and others' confidence, Sorge had become one of Stalin's most important sources of information on Germany and Japan's military status. However, in spite of Sorge's continued warnings, the Soviets ignored him and believed that Japan was the real danger. With the World War approaching, however, the net was closing in fast. Soon, the Japanese police had caught Sorge and Ozaki. Sorge's wife was sent to a gulag and Sorge was tortured into a confession by the Japanese police. Sorge and Ozaki were hung in 1944. And now we come to the Sanrizuka Struggle. This is one that deserves a whole video project on it. Maybe one day I'll make it. But for now, we'll settle for an iceberg video. In a country like Japan where land is at a premium, an international airport in the capital needing an expansion was always going to present a problem. When it was Haneda Airport, it was almost an impossible problem to solve. If you look at the map here, you can see that if they wanted to expand Haneda, they would need to build more land for themselves. Just impossible. So they quickly began to scout for a new site and found that locals were generally disinterested. When they settled on the site at Sanrizuka in nearby Chiba and confirmed that a large number of private lots would need to be purchased, you can imagine how troublesome this would end up being. Some of the farmers were okay with being bought out, but others weren't. Even worse, this was occurring in the mid-1960s and would become a major focal point of conflict between the government and the radical left in the country. There was quite a bit of violence and no less than 5 deaths over the following decade, most of these being police officers. Various radical left groups even attacked each other to get control of the movement there. I wish I had time to cover it all, and they even had a castle. But in 1978, the airport was opened all the same. However, not every piece of land had been purchased, and some parts of the airport had abandoned lots throughout. In fact, since opening, there have been well over 500 violent attacks on the airport and the airport employees by radical leftists. It would take until 2023, almost 50 years, for the government to finally evict the last of the lots at the airport. Now on to something even more controversial, the Unification Church. The Unification Church, also known as the Moonies, are a very large South Korean cult. Recently in Japan, the connection between the Moonies and Japan's LDP and its political elite in general has come to the forefront of discussion as a result of the former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo's, big oopsie. The Moonies added quite a bit to Christianity in the same way that Mormons do. In effect, neither religion is particularly Christian as a Christian would understand it. They love their mass weddings and not paying their taxes. But more than anything else, they love to hate communism, or anything even remotely left-wing. In 1968, as the Moonies were growing stronger and the radical left was getting more radical, the Japanese right-wing's fixers were struggling to find a counter. Sasakawa Yoichi, Kodama Yoshio, and Kishi Nobusuke, he appears in multiple tiers of this iceberg list, began to work with the Moonies and helped found the International Federation for Victory Over Communism, which is a wild name for a wild organization. This was a Moonie front organization and helped a bit to fight back against the left and provide political activists to counter the leftists. This was the start of the Moonies' deepening involvement in politics, especially in Japan. The Universal Peace Federation and a laundry list of other organizations soon joined as another arm of the Moonies in politics. Now they had thoroughly permeated Japanese politics. For a long time, the extreme wealth of the Moonies and their almost untouchable level of support at the highest levels of Japanese politics made them seem above criticism. They operated in plain sight and did what they wanted to buy and peddle influence in Japan's politics, all while abusing and scamming their parishioners. However, the sudden perforation of Abe Shinzo led to a huge change in Japan's way of looking at the Unification Church. Suddenly, the case was blown wide open over the course of a couple minutes. It set off what almost amounted to a witch hunt, with people creating lists of associated politicians and looking for any and all involvement or connection to the Unification Church. Though all of this shock and awe proved to be mostly toothless, little has come from the allegations. It's all rather disappointing. Something less disappointing and more interesting, Empress Aiko. Well, it's never going to happen now, but for a period of about 5 years, then Prince Naruhito's only child, his daughter, Princess Aiko, was to be the successor to the imperial throne after him. This is in part because of the very strong pruning of who was to be included as an imperial family member after World War II. Only male descendants and unmarried women would be included in the Imperial line. For whatever reason, the Imperial family also had lots and lots and lots and lots of girls. In fact, since the birth of Prince Furuhito in 1965, there had been no boys born. Given Japan's succession laws, this presented a very unique position where Prince Naruhito's daughter, Princess Aiko, was born where she could have ended up as the Empress of Japan if the laws had changed. This sparked a number of discussions demanding that the rules regarding succession be changed to secure the future of the imperial family. However, the birth of Prince Fumihito's son, Prince Hisahito, has temporarily shelved any discussion of reform of the succession. It's likely that there will be changes made in the future, but for now, things have more or less solidified on the young Prince Hisahito. This is where I unfortunately also have to tell you about another incident, imperial bullying. Now you might be expecting that perhaps the girl who would be empress had a bit of an ego to her, that she was nasty to her peers on account of her wealth and prestige. Actually, it was the exact opposite. Now the specifics of the event are rather fuzzy, but it all started in 2010 with Princess Aiko not going to school for several days under the pretense of having a bad cold. Her temperature went down, however, and then she started to complain of a stomachache and severe anxiety, so she only went to her 4th period class. This was at the illustrious Gakushuin Elementary course. Only the rich and powerful could get in. A few days later, the major magazine Aira was preparing to publish a news article purporting to tell the full story. Nomura Issei, one of the Imperial Household Agency's top bureaucrats, was forced to go to the public and explain the situation. Now for the Imperial House of Japan, they've been quite quiet and uncontroversial for more than a few decades now. But this time they were going to wade into some murky waters because parts of the story they tell ended up getting disputed by the Gakushuin school administrators. Nomura alleged that boys at the school had been acting wild and rough with some of their classmates. When pressed, Nomura actually denied any bullying had taken place, and it was unclear if she had even been a recipient of violent behavior or not. While this controversy was playing out, then Princess Masako attended school with her daughter Aiko. This isn't an unheard of thing in Japan, but it's not a good sign. The exact cause of what happened has never been found out, actually. There is a theory that she got knocked over by some boys and hit her head on a shoe cubby, but ultimately there was little proof for any allegation, and while 2 boys had been identified as potential culprits, the gag order inside the school was strong. This whole crisis came in the wake of controversy surrounding Princess Aiko's mother, Princess Masako's adjustment disorder, and her issues with anxiety. This is illustrative of the differences between the Japanese and, say, the British royals. The British royals are almost expected to act like rapacious, ill-mannered thieves, but in Japan, the public expected them to be perfect, and the stress can be stifling. Ultimately, Princess Aiko returned to schooling and has had some issues with anxiety like her mother, but has seemingly rebounded and has graduated college just recently. All's well that ends well, ain't that right, folks? Yasukuni Shrine. There's no doubt in my mind that you've already heard of this place before. The shrine and the controversy is another video that I should probably make sometime. If you hear it described in its most basic terms, it won't seem that bad actually. It's a private Shinto shrine that has been in operation since the 1870s, which enshrines people who died in service of Japan. Many of these being Japanese soldiers who died during the Second World War. The US has many similar locations where people who lost their lives for the country are remembered, even for wars that are, shall we say, less than popular with certain demographics. Many of these are on public land. It becomes an issue, however, when the shrine goes out of its way to enshrine Japanese war criminals who were in the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, including Tojo and Unit 731 members, who specialized in human experimentation. If you don't happen to know what Unit 731 was, it's actually not included in the tier list because there's not a lot to say or explain about it, and I don't feel like discussing it honestly. I may make a video about it at some point, but it's not on my immediate to-do list. Since 1979, when these last individuals were secretly added, the Imperial family has refused to visit. However, Prime Minister Nakasone, arguably Japan's most right-wing prime minister since 1945, has made it a tradition for Japanese prime ministers from the Liberal Democratic Party to visit the shrine. These visits are very controversial, and a majority of Japanese people are actually against them given the controversial nature of the shrine. While the shrine itself is rhetorically bad, the adjoining museum is arguably worse. At this museum, it may seem normal on the surface. It has some historical pieces, some photos of dead Japanese soldiers, stuff like that. It also has a locomotive that was used on the Thai-Burma Railway that was built with slave labor, and numerous pieces of historical revisionism that go on to call the Tokyo war crime trials as show trials. It is a private business and not owned or operated by the state, so if you go to Tokyo, just don't visit. Now that we're talking about controversial stuff, let's discuss some other controversial topics. The Liancourt Rocks and the Senkaku Islands. The Liancourt Rocks, also called Dokdo or Takeshima depending on who you ask, are in the middle of the ocean. They're just some rocks. However, around them there is quite a bit of fish and potentially, maybe, perhaps natural gas, maybe. There's tons of nonsense associated with these island disputes, so I have a tough time taking them seriously. Usually the owner is obvious in spite of the reams of paperwork dedicated to trying to prove a historical basis for claims. It's like trying to watch guys argue over which superhero would beat which. Just fantastical conjecture, which doesn't reflect reality. Possession is 9/10 of the law, so trying to claim, oh well in 1532 we had this written down in our sea charts, really means jack squat to me and just about everybody else. Let's look at who occupies the islands and what the most recent history is. Now, while Japan did originally, as of around 1903, occupied the Liancourt Rocks, since 1945 they lost control. To the surprise of many people, land, even islands, does have a habit of changing hands after war. The reason why Japan lost these particular islands is because the South Koreans occupied them after World War II. If you look at the so-called MacArthur Line, it's on the South Korean side anyway, on top of that. During the 1950s, there was some tussling in the ocean between South Korea and Japan. Neither side recognized the other until 1965. When the pair did recognize each other, there was no discussion over the Liancourt Rocks, and in effect, the Liancourt Rocks were recognized as South Korean. This is the same treaty that Japan uses, rightly I believe, to argue that it does not need to provide additional compensation to South Koreans since it was handled in that treaty. The Liancourt Rocks are also much closer to South Korea than Japan. The Liancourt Rocks have been occupied by South Korea more or less continuously ever since the 1940s. It is the subject of much nationalist dick-waving, and I don't think this is going to change in the next few years, unfortunately. Also, this is a personal thing, but in spite of being called Takeshima, Bamboo Island in Japanese, I assure you, there's no bamboo on Takeshima. A much better solution would be to set up a shared EEZ zone in the area and cooperate. South Korea and Japan actually already does this in a different area, admittedly to little effect. Unfortunately, both Japan and South Korea are very good at being petty to each other in spite of their many shared interests. It really is a shame. Now, the Senkaku Islands. These are claimed by Japan and China, that is to say both Beijing and Taipei. They have some fishing areas around them and potentially some natural gas, but it's hard to say. At no point had China occupied the Senkaku Islands. At no point did Chinese people live or work on the Senkaku Islands. Japan occupied the Senkaku Islands since the 1890s. Japan did have citizens that lived and worked on the Senkaku Islands. Neither China had an opinion on the Senkaku Islands until there was discussion of potential natural gas reserves there. Since then, China and Chinese nationalists have tried to claim the uninhabited islands for themselves. Additionally, Obama stated that the Senkaku Islands were covered under the US-Japan Security Treaty, meaning that it was the US's position that the islands were Japanese possessions. Thanks, Obama? This is somehow not the most pathetic sea dispute China is involved in. In fact, they've quarreled with South Korea over an underwater rock before. So, yeah. Kinda pathetic. Speaking of South Korea, the final entry on this opening tier list are the Zainichi Koreans. If you've been around long enough, you've probably heard at least one person try to push back on the narrative that Japan is an ethnically homogenous country. It is mostly, but for a long time its only major ethnic minority were Koreans. They're called the Zainichi Koreans, that is to say the inside Japan Koreans. Remember back to the earthquake massacre? The reason why Koreans were so heavily targeted was likely because of an increasing number of Koreans that had come to reside inside of Japan. By 1945, this process had reached its peak with around 2 million in Japan. By the end of the year, however, about half would leave. Those who remained began to form the basis of a new community when he took part in the newly formed League of Koreans in Japan, which was a group associated with the Japanese Communist Party and supported North Korea. It was banned in 1949 after a variety of incidents, and its successor organization, Jongryong, was formed in 1955. The pro-South Korean Mindan was formed in 1946 and has existed ever since. Others sought to control the Japanese black markets. Few succeeded in this venture. Some joined the Yakuza, and a small number of Zainichi Korean gangsters gained notoriety. But generally, Zainichi Koreans worked hard in the food stall and pachinko businesses to succeed. But things weren't easy. Beyond the expected discrimination, there were several odd stumbling blocks the community was subjected to, namely access to the national pension system and the child care allowance. But they received access to both in 1982 as a result of Japan signing on to the Convention relating to status of refugees. They were also unable to vote in elections unless they were naturalized. In 1991, the Special Permanent Resident status was created. The status of minorities in Japan who ended up there during World War II and just never returned has always been a complicated one, but the Special Permanent Resident status considerably eased the situation. They still can't vote unless they naturalize, but they essentially have a special status as both Korean and Japanese residents. For example, they can come and go from Japan as they please. They even have their own special cards. Since the 90s, however, the Zainichi Koreans have increasingly fallen behind other minority groups in the country and are now being beaten up by the Chinese and Vietnamese residents in Japan. There are actually more Zainichi Vietnamese than Zainichi Koreans in Japan if you don't include the estimations of naturalized Koreans. So things have changed quite considerably since the 1990s. Who could have thought? Alright folks, that's it. Tier 1 is done. On the next layers there'll be even more entries. I am actually annoyed at past me for picking out this many things to discuss. But you know me. Always over the top. Do let me know if you enjoyed the video. If people like this sort of thing, I'll continue it. If not, then I won't. If you like this video, please leave a like and maybe share it with someone else who might enjoy it. If you have a comment, feel free to leave one down below. If you liked my content a lot, you can donate via Ko-fi or join my Patreon. Thank you for your consideration. Also do check out my Twitch. I usually stream on Wednesdays, Fridays, Saturdays, and sometimes Sundays, typically starting at around 2 p.m. EST. Without further ado, check out this video. It's pretty good. Good stories only. Thank you.